Hello, this is an open letter to NorCaltheologian. Dear NorCaltheologian, hi, I'm Deconverted Man. You know about me. I don't know if you've watched any of my videos. I wanted to try, if I could, to get across some concepts, some ideas, some things to you. And I don't think that a simple private message will do that. So here then is this open letter. You seem to be under a lot of impressions. You seem to have a lot of ideas about how the world works and how things are. Perhaps you were told that these things are true. Perhaps you've learned them. Perhaps you sincerely believe them. And I would ask you to be willing to challenge that assumption, be willing to challenge this idea that you have. There is this idea that you have that without God, logic does not exist, and that the atheist or atheism has a worldview. Both of these ideas are not true. Let's tackle first the last problem, and then I'll get back to the first one. Atheism, or atheists, do not have any worldview at all. Whoever told you that, or wherever you learned that, or if you came up with it yourself, it's just not true. You might think that we do, or think that there must be, but it's not the case. You cannot say that simply because somebody defines themselves as an atheist that they instantly have a world view. One of your comments on my videos said something about that my worldview is naturalistic atheism or something to that effect. And that's not my position. I don't hold that worldview. In fact, I personally have no worldview. Now, maybe you've been told that everyone has to have a worldview. That's not true. Perhaps you've been told that a person's worldview must encompass everything, every aspect. It has to be one single system that encompasses the entire world. That's not true as well. I personally was under that same impression when I was a Christian. When I began to research in earnest logic and philosophy on my own, I realized that this idea that I had once held wasn't the correct way of looking at things. It wasn't a true idea. So I gave it up. And I did so pretty easily. It wasn't that of an important idea. So I would ask you to research for yourself philosophy as well as logic to find out if your idea is true or false. You don't have to borrow LeVar Burton's phrase, you don't have to take my word for it. Now, you cannot know what a worldview that I might be holding is without asking me. You could say, Deconverted Man, what's your worldview? And then I would give you the answer. None. I have none. Or if I must have one, then it would be a combination of different ones. But I don't think that I have one. I could be wrong. If you insist, no, your worldview is X, then you've created a straw man. Because you've said, this is what your position is, rather than asking what my position is. This is a created straw man. If I say, hey, Christian, your position is that you support slavery. You don't have to agree with that. No, I don't support slavery. It might or might not be promoted in the Bible, but there's different ways of looking at that. And even if it was promoted in the Bible, I could still personally be against it. Maybe that's hypocritical, maybe it's not, maybe there's a way to look at that makes sense to you personally. But when I say, as a Christian, you have to support slavery, I've created a straw man, because it's not your position. It might be, but I can't know that. Instead, I should ask, hey, as a Christian, do you support slavery? And then I would have an answer. So, maybe you believe that all atheists are naturalistic atheists, and thus that's their worldview, and under that worldview, this particular thing doesn't work. But that's a belief, and beliefs can be wrong, and in this case, it is wrong. You do not know what the worldview is of any particular atheist that you'll find yourself in a conversation with. So, you've created a straw man. Now, if you truly do care about logic, then you should try to avoid logical fallacies. If you know anything about logic, then again, you should try to avoid logical fallacies whenever possible. So let's get back to that first problem. You have this idea that without God, logic cannot exist. The two are independent from each other. I know that you are a proponent of presuppositional apologetics. I really would encourage you to get away from that, because there's far, far better ways to defend God than this incoherent mess of a system. But let me just explain why this is not true, and why believing it is true is detrimental to your own argumentation. Right now, within logic, there is a rule or law called the law of identity. This is the idea that A cannot be not A. If a rock is there, it's a rock. A rock is a rock. It can't not be a rock. Now, the question that philosophers like to mess with is, what happens if I chisel away a little bit of that rock? Is the fragment that I got still that rock, or is the original rock that rock? The law of identity says the original rock is always that rock. But at some point, I've destroyed that rock if I continue to chisel away at it, and there's nothing left of the original. What happened then? Now, with our modern understanding of different things, especially quantum physics, A isn't A, because A can change and come in and out of existence. What do we do then? And if we really examine, let's just say, the letter A itself, we recognize the fact that no matter how perfectly I duplicate it, the next A is not the original A. And in fact, the original A is no longer the original A 5 seconds from now, because it's now 5 seconds older than it used to be. So A is never A. Now, logic will, I think, one day evolve, change slowly through time, to encompass this fact of reality. But right now, it's an okay approximation of reality to have this rule of identity. It's a useful rule, so we haven't discarded it or changed it yet, but one day we might. So, if we did change it, and if we came up with a new rule, say the law of sometimes identity or something like that, that means that the old rule was an error, and in fact it's always been an error, and any arguments that used it could be seen as being an error. We now have to go back and fix whatever arguments that used it if we want those arguments to be up to date. So that means that the new way is the real way, and the old way wasn't. Now, what if again later on we change that rule again, and if we continue to change it over and over again, at what point do we get to the real reality of logic? The idea that God, therefore logic, would assume that God already knows all the perfect rules of logic, and we're just stumbling along blindly trying to figure them out. But if that's the case, we're still using our human brain to try to figure out these rules. We figured out the rule of identity, and we will eventually change that rule of identity to modify it to be closer to reality. So if we're allowed to stumble along this path to the eventual correct logic, and as we stumble along this path, the thing that we now see as being true, or true rules, is true. We can't talk about the future, we're not there yet. Similar to science, logic changes. So we say, this is the way that this is now. Tomorrow it could be different, but for now my argumentation is valid because I used this particular formula and because right now that rule is true. Well, if it's tomorrow it's not true, well then I'll deal with that tomorrow, but right now it's fine. If we are allowed to stumble around, if you will, blindly about what logic really is, and in fact we have no choice but to do this, then God's existence is independent of our current understanding of logic. Perhaps God does know the final way that logic really does work, and one day we might get there, but we may never get there, and if God doesn't just tell us how logic is meant to function, then we'll never have that knowledge from that source. We'll have to have it from our own source. So that means that logic is independent of God. God's existence is not necessary for logic. See, we're able to come up with these rules and laws about logic, to change them, to stumble around, if you will, as we change them. And God's existence is completely irrelevant to this process. It may or may not exist. It doesn't change how we view logic at all. Now, the other problem is that by insisting that God and logic are intertwined, you've created a logically fallacious argument. Basically, you're saying that without X, Y can't be true. Without God, there is no logic. God exists, logic can't exist without God, therefore God. Well, that's begging the question. And it also doesn't give an argument for God itself, so there's a formal fallacy. So there's two logical errors in that particular argumentation, and maybe I've simplified the argument too much here, but nonetheless, you're basically saying that logic is real, which isn't exactly how I would say it, but I think that that's what you're saying, and I could be wrong. But you're basically saying that logic is a thing that exists metaphysically outside our brains, and that because of this, God. And then you're using an illogical argument to say that. So if it is true, then you are not using logic to get to the conclusion. So how can I determine, using logic, that I agree is a thing? I don't think it's metaphysical, but I do agree that the rules of logic are fine the way they are for now, at any rate. Maybe they'll change tomorrow, but right now we deal with what we have. And you're not making a logically coherent argument, so because I agree with how logic works, I can't accept your idea and conclusion. So what you need to do then is figure out a way to make a logically coherent argument that argues that God is a prerequisite for logic to function or exist in the first place. And if you cannot or will not, then I have to be skeptical about that. So it really puts you in a position that's a losing position, because the fact of the matter is, there isn't a way to make a logically coherent argument for that conclusion, because that conclusion's an error. God's existence, if God exists, is independent from logic's existence. We humans came up with logic. We have changed it throughout time and will continue to change it throughout time to suit our needs. The whole metaphysical argument is better made with maybe mathematics rather than logic. Mathematics could be said to be a metaphysical thing that only makes sense if God exists, but again, you need a logically coherent argument for that to work. You'd have to explain metaphysics, you have to explain God, you need at least two separate arguments for both, so you're back to square one. I've heard people argue metaphysics, and it's interesting. It's a philosophical idea. It may or may not be valid. I'm not convinced that it is. But if you want to argue for it, fine. But use a logically coherent argument to get to that. You can't use the argument that you're trying to use right now. I know you want to. I know you think it's right. I know you think it's true. But I'm here to tell you it's not. And I'm here to tell you it won't work. So, you don't have to believe me. And in fact, you probably don't believe me right now. That's fine. I would ask you to do the research on your own. Learn logic. Just learn it. Just read a couple of logic textbooks. Understand it. Maybe take a class in it. And find out what it is, and more importantly, what it is not. As far as the metaphysical stuff, if you want to learn more about that, then take a couple of philosophy classes or read a number of philosophy books on the subject of metaphysics and things like that. I'll put a couple of books that I've personally read in the description below as suggestions for places to start. So, NorCaltheologian, that's my open letter to you. A lot of people will say, he's not going to listen, he's not going to do this. Why not prove them wrong? Look, I would love for you to create a logically coherent argument about anything, and you say, oh, I don't see the point. Well, okay, you don't want to prove me wrong. Alright, that's your choice. Maybe you have other things to do, I don't know. But look, I want you to learn. I want you to grow as a person. As the Bible says, one sword sharpens the other. Although I would say it would be better to use a grinding stone to sharpen any object. But still, the idea, I think, is that we humans should try to help each other out, no matter what our worldview or lack thereof might be. I'm trying to help you by encouraging you to learn about logic and to form an argumentation that will get me to the conclusion that you already hold. Right now, you can't do that. Perhaps if you learn logic, you will be able to do that. Yours sincerely, Deconverted.